Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Amol Naik. Hope you're taking good care of yourself and your loved ones in these tough COVID times. I, on behalf of Indra family, welcome you all for this very important webinar topic: how to tackle implantation failure. I'm delighted today to have with us senior IVF specialist from Indra family, who have joined us as panelists. We have today Dr. Taruna Jham from Udaipur, Dr. Anjali Galan from Prayagraj, Dr. Urmila Sharma from Jaipur, and Dr. Shashmita Naik from Bhubaneswar. As we all know, recurrent implantation failure has been a real nightmare for all of us, much to the distress of the couple as well as equally frustrating for the doctor. Even after so many years of research, we haven't been able to understand completely its complexities and hence unable to decode its enigma till now. I understand it's a vast topic, but we shall try and unravel it into layers and make it far more easier for our audience to understand. Let me take you through the entire topic, the outline. Today, we'll be speaking first on the definition part, then we'll go through the risk factors associated. I'll also take you and understand briefly the implantation process. Our panelists will help us understand the etiological factors involved in it, the causative factors, and finally we'll take a look into the few case scenarios which we look into day-to-day life as clinicians, and we'll have a take-home message at the end. Coming on to the definition, the inability to achieve clinical pregnancy after 3 embryo transfers with high quality embryos or more than 10 embryos in multiple transfers. This is how Eschere defined it in 2005. However, it was met with a lot of criticism, and the reason being there is no universal definition for good quality embryo. Also, variables like age, stage of embryo, whether it was a fresh or a frozen embryo transfer, these all parameters are not addressed. And hence, in 2014, Coglan et al. Came up with a new definition which states failure to achieve clinical pregnancy after transfer of at least 4 good quality embryos in a minimum of 3 fresh or frozen cycles in a woman under the age of 40 years. Now, this seems to be more practical enough. One thing we have understood, there is no universally accepted definition now. So also, the pathophysiology is hardly understood. Now, since our topic revolves mostly around the implantation process, let me take you through the actual implantation, what I mean by that. Basically, implantation is a process by which a mature blastocyst embryo penetrates the superficial endometrial epithelium and gets eventually internalized to develop further. The first step in this is adplantation, wherein the hashed out blastocysts get adherent to the pinopoids of the endometrium and invades into the deeper layers of the endometrium to get nourishment from its vasculature. It usually starts by around 6th day post-ovulatory and takes around another 2 to 3 days to complete. However simple this process appears to be, believe me, it involves a complex and intricate interplay between multiple immunomodulatory substances mediated by the prevalent hormones, which must happen in an optimum receptive phase of the endometrium. As we all know, the rate of implantation, even in the most optimum environment, is not more than 30 to 40%. And hence, this is the most important rate limiting step for any IVF protocol. As uh, for any disorders, we have risk factors here: the age, BMI, smoking, and stress. Any lady who is more than 35 years has an increased frequency of aneuploid, so much so to the extent of almost 35% previously when it was done by FISH technique. Now, with the advent of CGS array, it has shown that these aneuploidies are to the extent of almost 58%. Also, there is decrease in the endometrial thickness and the resistivity, ultimately hampering the implantation potential of the embryo. Also, we know in conventional stimulation protocols, when a lady who is more than 35 years, they respond poorly to the stimulation. Whereas in BMI, any lady who is more than 27 kilograms per meter square, she requires a heavy doses of gonadotropin in the conventional stimulation. Also, the oocyte yield is hampered. And as we have seen in recurrent pregnancy losses, there is increased miscarriages also, which happen equally responsible for recurrent implantation failure. Whereas for smoking and stress, in females, it reduces the estradiol levels, disrupts the corpus luteal function, ultimately leading to luteal phase defect. In males, it leads to a picture of oligoastenoteratozoospermia. What I mean by that, it decreases the sperm count, decreases the motility, and also the percentage of abnormal morphology increases. Now, let us understand from our panelist a few causative factors. I would like to ask Dr. Anjali, uh, what is your idea about the embryonal factor responsible for recurrent implantation failure?
Yeah, good evening, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Amol, for the question. So, the probable causes of RIF can be divided into four broad categories: embryonal factors, endometrial factors, immunological factors, and few miscellaneous factors. So, as we all know, that implantation involves a crosstalk between an embryo and an endometrium. So, if the embryos are of suboptimal quality, which could be due to the poor quality of gametes, it could be due to the zona hardening or suboptimal culture conditions, then obviously such embryos, their chances of getting implanted are low. And even if they get implanted, there are chances that patient might land up into recurrent miscarriages. Also, it has been seen that 2 to 3% of the patients of RIF actually have some chromosomal abnormalities like non-disjunction of chromosome or translocations. And when these patients, they undergo IVF, there are chances that the embryos which are developed might be having some genetic defects, and such patients, there are chances of implantation failure or recurrent miscarriages. So yes, in a patient of recurrent implantation failure, embryonal factors do play a major role, and they should be looked into in patients with RIF.
Yes, very well said. As rightly pointed out, there is a complex interplay between the embryo as well as and the endometrium. Let us understand from Dr. Sashmita, how will endometrial receptivity affect the implantation potential?
A very good evening to all of you. Yes, as we know, a receptive endometrium is an essential part for the implantation process. And the relationship between embryo and endometrium can be compared to that with seed and soil. That means if you sow good quality of seed in the soil, then only you will be able to get a healthy plant. Likewise, if good, healthy euploid embryo be transferred inside receptive endometrium, then only chance of implantation and a healthy pregnancy is possible. So there are various factors that impact on the endometrial receptivity. It can be anatomical factor or it can be endometrium itself. In anatomical, it can be congenital or acquired type. In congenital Mullerian anomaly, we know septum is the most common cause, most common prevalent. Once it was believed that septum only causes pregnancy complication and it has nothing to do with implantation. But now the thought process has changed after the recent studies revealed that septum also causes difficulty in conception and IVF failure. It could be due to decreased vascular supply and restoration of the cavity. So irrespective of the size of the septum, it needs to be resected before we proceed for ART treatment. And moving ahead, submucous fibroid. It causes distortion of the cavity, increased uterine contractility, impaired vascularization, chronic inflammatory process. So studies have shown it is not only the implantation process, but also it decreases the clinical pregnancy rate, ongoing pregnancy rate, and increases the pregnancy miscarriages. Then again, polyp the same, it prevents the implantation. Then intrauterine adhesion. Adhesion, it prevents the initial part of the implantation by preventing the adhesion of the embryos to the luminal surface of the endometrium. Now, there is always an association of thin endometrium and bad ART outcome. Thin endometrium could be due to congenital problem like T-shaped uterus, or sometimes associated with Townes syndrome, and sometimes iatrogenic, like any previous radiotherapy to the pelvis, any previous iatrogenic intracavitary surgery like BNC or suction evacuation, or any chronic infection like tuberculosis. Then when there is chronic infection or inflammation of endometrium, it decreases the endometrial receptivity. Again, immunological factor. When there is a dysregulation between the maternal immunocyte and different molecules that is required for implantation process, then also it causes decrease in the endometrial receptivity and IVF failure. We need to rule out hypercoagulability in the female because some studies have shown that the hemophilic condition is higher in the RI population. It may be because of thrombosis, and it prevents the trophoblastic invasion. Now adenomyosis, recently it is gaining more and more attention, and new studies are, it is telling about the negative impact of adenomyosis in ART outcome. And when there is local dysregulation of endocrine and immunological factor, then also there is a decrease in endometrial receptivity and IVF failure. So dear doctors, we need to rule out all the endometrial factors before proceeding for next IVF cycle in cases of recurrent implantation failure.
Very well said, Dr. Susmita. You have highlighted here the immunological factor. I suppose immunology in itself is a vast topic, but in terms of recurrent implantation failure and today's webinar topic, I would like to understand from Dr. Taruna. Can you give us more insight into the immunology in the affecting the implantation potential?
Thank you, Dr. Amol. Role of immune system in recurrent implantation failure and in patients with recurrent miscarriages is still controversial. But yes, nowadays many studies are coming which are supporting the role of immunomodulation in patients with recurrent implantation failure. As we all know that pregnancy is a state of immunotolerance, and generation of this immunotolerance is very important, as embryo is semi-allograft, and this semi-allograft has to implant and develop inside the uterine cavity. So how this immunotolerance is generated? As you told that immunology is a vast subject and little bit complicated, but to understand it simply, there are two kinds of cells, Th1 cells and Th2 cells. Th1 cells generate cell-mediated immune response and release of pro-inflammatory cytokines like TNF-alpha, interleukin-2, interferon gamma, and increased phagocytosis. On the other hand, Th2 cells cause humoral immune response and release of anti-inflammatory cytokines like interleukin-6, interleukin-4, interleukin-10, and decrease in phagocytosis. So we can understand that Th2 cells are responsible for immunotolerance and Th1 cells cause immunorejection. If there is any imbalance between these Th1 and Th2 cells, this can lead to immunorejection and implantation failure. Apart from these T helper cells, there are NK cells. Increase in peripheral as well as uterine NK cells can lead to immunorejection. This is about alloimmune factors, and if the patient is having autoimmune diseases like anti-phospholipid antibody or high anti-thyroid antibodies or autoimmune diabetes mellitus, these patients are also at increased risk of implantation failure because presence of antibodies in this patient leads to microvascular thrombosis, and in that way it can hinder implantation and further placental development. So yes, autoimmunity and alloimmunity both play a role in patients with recurrent implantation failure.
Yeah, very well. Now that we have understood that there has to be successful embryo endometrial crosstalk, and for that the immunomodulation of the body is very important. But as clinicians, we also understand in IVF practice, the embryo transfer technique has to be the most optimum and is most vital. So any faulty embryo transfer technique will definitely hamper the implantation rates and decreases the success. We must understand, and we all have been facing this, especially when there is manipulation of the negotiation of the cervix, in cases when there is tightly closed cervix as a result of fibrosis or because of previous surgeries, or in case of adenomyotic bulky uterus, when there is deviation of the endometrial canal, or for that matter, angulation of the endocervical canal itself, or a cervical fibroid which is pressing on to the angle and leading to a difficult embryo transfer. I suppose all these factors, they lead to a suboptimal embryo transfer, and definitely adds on to the decrease in the success rate of implantation. After this, I believe there are certain few more factors which are responsible for implantation failure. I'd like to understand from Dr. Urmila, can you give in more highlights onto this?
Yes, Dr. Amol, and good evening, everyone. So apart from the causes mentioned earlier, there are certain other benign conditions also which may play some role in recurrent implantation failure. For example, in PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, we know that there is hyperandrogenemia, hyperinsulinemia. So these hormonal disturbance leads to dysregulation of various steroid receptors inside the endometrium during the window of implantation. causes upregulation of androgen receptors, and there is failure to downregulate the estrogen receptors, and there is deficiency of progesterone hormone. So this dysregulation leads to failed implantation and may play some role in decreased implantation. Another condition is hydrosalpinx, and various studies have shown that presence of hydrosalpinx has a negative impact on the IVF outcome. And it may be due to the mechanical effect, because the hydrosalpinx fluid, it acts as a mechanical barrier, and it may have an embryotoxic effect also, and it also alters the cytokine environment of the endometrium. Similarly, in endometriosis, we all know that there is an altered cytokine milieu inside the endometrium, which may hinder implantation and lead to recurrent implantation failure. And last of all, the conventional stimulation cycles in which we use the higher dose of gonadotropins, and we are planning for fresh embryo transfer, then the supraphysiological hormone levels, they may be detrimental to implantation and may lead to recurrent implantation failure. So yes, these conditions should also be taken into consideration while evaluating the cases of recurrent implantation failure.
Yeah. So now that we have touched upon almost every other factor responsible for recurrent implantation failure, we'll see now into a few case scenarios which affect us in our day-to-day practice. The first case revolves around a 31-year-old lady who is married since 5 years, known case of hypothyroidism, and she's on treatment of Thyronorm 25 micrograms. She underwent previously 2 to 3 cycles of IUI, but all failed. Her hysterosalpingography was done, which showed a bilateral tuber block. So they decided to proceed ahead for an IVF treatment, and her ovarian parameters showed an antral follicle count of 8 to 9 follicles in each ovary. On ultrasound, the uterus was normal, and an AMH was around 4.2. Endometrium on day 18 was somewhere around 7 millimeter. Her husband's semen parameters were within normal limits. So they proceeded ahead for an ICSI cycle, and in the first cycle, 3 embryos of grade 1 quality were transferred at an endometrium of 7.2 millimeter, but the result came out to be negative. In the second cycle, before proceeding ahead, they did a diagnostic hysteroscopy done, which showed a bilateral ostia, which was visualized well. Fundal adhesions were present, for which the metroplasty was done. However, the endometrium was pale and multiple micropolyps were seen. Endometrium histology and a TB PCR was sent, which came out to be negative. So, frozen embryo transfer of 2 grade 1 embryos again at an endometrium of 7.2 millimeter was done. But again, the beta HCG turned out to be negative. Frustrated, they went ahead for a third cycle of an ICSI, wherein the patient underwent a fresh ANTAG protocol with an AMH of 3.8. This attempt 2 blastocyst grade embryos were transferred. Also, laser assisted hatching was done, but still the same result. Beta HCG came out to be negative. Now, I would like to understand from Dr. Shashmita, which investigations would you like to do so as to further manage this case?
Well, for any cases of recurrent implantation failure, a review consultation is very much important. In fact, it is the foundation for the future plan of action. So, first I would like to say the approach to any case of recurrent implantation failure should be multidisciplinary approach. That means it not only the fertility specialist, but also the embryologist, and if needed, then sonologist, counselor, and a fertility surgeon need to be involved. Then history taking is very important. About the previous IVF history, we need to inquire in detail about the previous protocol used, the stimulation medication, the pickup note, what is the quality of the oocyte retrieve, embryo form, and the embryo technique in detail. We should take the history, which will help us for the further plan. And in such cases, the counseling takes a very important role, because we know by the time the RI patient that comes to us, they're very much frustrated, and they're desperate to know about their future hope. So we need to ensure the patient, we need to understand what is the rationality of our treatment, what is the potential benefit and cost involved in our next plan of action. So here another point I'd like to stress that as one T-shirt does not fit all, because there are different etiologies. So approach should be personalized interventional therapy. So in this particular case, she is 31 years young female, and there is a history of transfer of apparently good quality of embryo, and history of addition, intrauterine addition, and hysteroscopic finding of such micropolyposis. It indicate towards the endometrial pathology. So in this particular case, I would like to do the certain investigation. First, I need to rule out the chromosomal disorder in the couple by doing parental karyotyping. I need to rule out the thrombophilic condition in the female. We need to rule out any DNA damage in the semen parameter by doing DA5. A 3D pelvic ultrasonography is must to rule out any endometrial, myometrial, adnexal, or any ovarian pathology. And last but not the least, the relook hysteroscopy and endometrial biopsy to rule out any unrecognized pathology.
Yes, very well said, Doctor. Now, primarily, we have understood that this case revolves around the endometrium, and definitely it is at fault. And a few hysteroscopic findings were suggestive of chronic endometritis. So, I'd like to understand from Dr. Urmila, how does chronic endometritis plays a role in recurrent implantation failure case?
Yes, Dr. Amol, as Dr. Sashmita pointed out, that in this case there was hysteroscopy was showing micropolyposis with pale endometrium, and in all the embryo transfers and endometrium was just borderline. It was 7 to 7.2 mm, and tuberculosis has already been ruled out. So we should definitely think of other causes of endometritis. So what happens in endometritis? There is inflammation of the endometrial mucosa, and it is mostly caused by bacterial pathogens. And this inflammation, which occurs in chronic endometritis, it has a negative impact on the implantation because it affects the decidualization and also alters the expression of various growth factors, cytokines, which play an important role in the implantation process. And retrospectively, it has been seen that in patients of recurrent implantation failure, chronic endometritis was seen in about 30% of the cases. So yes, we should definitely take into consideration and diagnose and treat this condition well in time before proceeding for further IVF cycles.
Yeah. So, how to diagnose and treat it, Dr. Urmila?
Yes, for diagnosis of chronic endometritis, a few modalities are available. So most commonly used is histopathology, and the most characteristic finding is the presence of plasma cells in the endometrial stroma. And second diagnostic modality is immunohistochemistry, in which we can detect the CD138 cells, which are the plasma cell marker. Bacterial culture is also available, but in most of the cases, about 40 to 60% of the cases, the culture comes out to be negative, so it is less reliable. And for us, hysteroscopy is like a boon in which we can directly visualize the lesions. And the most common lesions which we generally see in chronic endometritis are the multiple small polyps, micropolyposis, which are small polyps less than 1 millimeter in diameter. Along with this, we can see hyperemia, which may be localized or generalized, giving a strawberry appearance. And third finding is the stromal edema. So once diagnosed, we should always go for the treatment of chronic endometritis, and evidence is in favor of oral antibiotics for the treatment of this condition. So suppose the culture is positive and it is showing gram-negative bacteria, then treatment can be ciprofloxacin BD for 10 days. If it is showing gram-positive bacteria, then we can give amoxicillin clavulanic acid for 8 days. And as in most of the cases, if the culture comes out to be negative, but if we are suspecting endometritis on hysteroscopy as well as on histopathology, then we can give an empirical course of single dose ceftriaxone 250 milligram IM followed by doxycycline and metronidazole for 14 days. So definitely this condition needs to be treated, especially in these cases of RIF before planning for further IVF cycle.
Yeah, very well explained, Urmila. As we have seen in this case, the endometrium has been persistently at a lower end. And I believe thin endometrium, for thin endometrium, especially in cases of recurrent implantation failure, endometrial adhesions is a very important factor which leads to thin endometrium. I would like to understand from Dr. Anjali, how do we manage severe endometrial adhesions in increasing the endometrial receptivity?
Yeah. So basically, patients with thin endometrium, it has been seen around 3 to 4% of the patients are having actually severe endometrial adhesions. And even after treatment, the chances of having a successful pregnancy are only 20 to 30%. So these are the most difficult group of patients to be tackled, but still we have few modalities, like we can offer them operative hysteroscopy with the ratio lysis, we can give them PRP therapy, GCSF therapy, and stem cell therapy. So when we are talking about operative hysteroscopy, we should use scissors rather than electrocautery, because with electrocautery there are chances that we might damage the surrounding healthy looking endometrium. And after the surgery, for the endometrial regeneration as well as to prevent the recurrence, the patient should be put on high dose estrogen therapy with either a pediatric Foley's or a Cook's balloon catheter to be kept inside the uterus for 7 to 10 days. Another therapy which has shown promising results is the PRP therapy. So what is PRP? These are the autologous activated platelets which contains growth factors, and they promote angiogenesis and tissue growth. So these are basically prepared from the patient's own blood, and the concentration of platelet varies from 4 to 8 times of the normal one. And then they are instilled 0.5 to 1 ml into the uterus with the help of an IUI catheter, and various case reports as well as RCTs have shown beneficial effect. And even in our own clinical practice, we have seen good results with this PRP therapy. Another therapy would be the GCSF. So GCSF is a hematopoietic cytokine, and it plays a role in endometrial regeneration as well as at the time of implantation. So 300 micrograms of GCSF can be instilled either into the uterus, or it can be given through a subcutaneous route. And there are various RCTs, even there is a Cochrane review which has shown its beneficial effects in patients with RIF as well as in thin endometrium patients. And then lastly, the role of stem cells is still experimental. These are the pluripotent cells which are generated from the from patient's bone marrow, or they are taken from the patient's menstrual blood, the endometrial stromal cells, or either from the umbilical cord. And these cells are then processed, and then they are injected at the endometrial junction at various points under short general anesthesia. And there are few case series which have shown good results. Those patients who were previously amenorrheic actually started having menses, and also there are case reports of patients having successful pregnancy following the stem cell therapy. So yes, these are the difficult patients, and but still they have some hope, and we can offer them these group of treatment modalities to have a better clinical outcome.
Very informative, Dr. Anjali. We have been often listening about endometrial receptivity, and we also understand and have read endometrial receptivity plays a very important role in the implantation of the embryo into the endometrium. I would like to understand from Dr. Taruna, how can we assess the endometrial receptivity? Dr. Taruna, you are mute.
Now you can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Yes, Dr. Amol. A normal embryo implantation requires a synchronized interaction between endometrium and embryo. If there is loss of this synchrony, this can result in implantation failure. There are many pathological conditions where endometrial receptivity is decreased or is hindered, like as mentioned by Dr. Sashmita, endometrial uterine septum, polyps, mucosa, this fibroids, submucosal fibroids, adenomyosis. In all these conditions, endometrial receptivity is decreased. But the question is that is a normal, very normal looking endometrium and a very normal looking embryo, which are in asynchronous, can result in implantation failure? Unfortunately, answer is yes. So here the role of endometrial receptivity assay comes in the scenario. We have to understand that endometrium is receptive during a particular period, which is called as window of implantation. Before and after this window of implantation, if embryo enters the uterine cavity, implantation is not possible. So endometrial receptivity assay checks this window of implantation for that particular patient. and use of personalized embryo transfer. Personalized embryo transfer, according to report of endometrial receptivity assay, has shown increase in reproductive performance of the patient with recurrent implantation failure. And this has been seen in a study that 25% of women with recurrent implantation failure have displaced window of implantation. So yes, endometrial receptivity array, it has a role in patients with recurrent implantation failure. But in this particular scenario, as the patient is having chronic endometritis, it has been seen that chronic endometritis decreases endometrial receptivity. We cannot say that endometrial receptivity array would be helpful in this patient. But yes, as the patient is having recurrent implantation failure, this can be helpful to detect the particular receptive period for that patient.
Yeah, very well said. Could you please also help us understand how this test can be performed?
Yes, Dr. Amol, for checking endometrial receptivity, we have to take endometrial biopsy in the cycle previous to the main ART cycle. This can be done in natural cycle, but better is to take endometrial biopsy in HRT cycle. So we have to start estrogen exposure from day 2 of the cycle, and after exposure of 14 days, we start progesterone. We take biopsy on P+5. That is the way. And the one important thing, which there was previously a myth that this report is not reproducible, but nowadays this has been proven over many studies that report of ERA is reproducible. That means if we do endometrial receptivity array in same patient in different cycle, the report is same.
Also, please help us interpreting this result of ERA assay.
Yes, Dr. Amol, whenever we order some testing, we get some reports. So if we get report of endometrial receptivity assay, it can be of two types. Either it will show receptive endometrium or non-receptive endometrium. If the report is showing that endometrium is receptive, very good. We'll do transfer according to the report. We'll, as we have taken biopsy on P+5, we'll do transfer on P+5. But if the report is showing non-receptive, then this can be of two types. Report will either show it is pre-receptive or it will show it is post-receptive. If the report is showing that endometrium is pre-receptive, then we have to repeat biopsy in next cycle at P+6. And if the report is showing post-receptive, then we have to repeat biopsy on P+4. And then after finding the window of implantation, we have to plan transfer accordingly.
So to summarize, in 30 to 45% cases of recurrent implantation failure with no obviously detectable pathology on a transvaginal ultrasound, hysteroscopy does manage to find abnormalities which otherwise would have missed. Hence, it is very prudent to proceed with diagnostic hysteroscopy and in the same setting manage polyp, synecdoche, submucous myoma accordingly, especially in cases of recurrent implantation failure. Hysteroscopy metroplasty with cold scissors does help in refractory thin endometrium with an additional endometrial scratching effect, which we'll see in our later slides. Treating chronic endometritis certainly enhances the implantation potential. And finally, with the help of endometrial receptive assay, we can understand this displacement of window of implantation seen in 30% of RIF cases. This should help us achieve optimum synchronization for subsequent embryo transfer. Now, coming on to a next case scenario. 39-year-old lady, married since 8 years, with previous 3 IVF failed. Her AMH was 1.2. Ultrasound was showing a normal uterus with a bilateral ovaries, a normal size, no any cyst, with an antral follicle count of 3 to 4 in each. Sperm analysis showed a teratospermic picture with a morphology of 2%. They went ahead for an ICSI cycle, and the first fresh transfer of grade 2 embryos at an endometrium of 8 mm was transferred, but beta HCG came out to be negative. In the second cycle, diagnostic histoolaparoscopy was performed. It showed normal findings. So they proceeded ahead for a frozen embryo transfer of 2 grade 2 blastocyst embryo. Laser assisted hatching was done, but again, beta HCG came out to be negative. Option of donor I discussed both, but the couple refused. They wanted to have their own biological child. And hence, a third cycle was proceeded ahead at an AMH of 0.92 with a sperm DFI of 35%. Frozen embryo transfers of single blast form, which was of a grade of 4A, and transferred at an endometrium of 8 mm. But same result, beta HCG came out to be negative. I would like to understand from Dr. Anjali, how will you manage this case?
Yeah. So basically, this is a case of RIF, which is probably due to the suboptimal embryo quality, and that is mainly because of the advanced age of the patient. Since this patient doesn't wish to go ahead with donor egg program, and we have to maximize our chances of getting pregnant with our own oocytes. So we have to develop various strategies which can be used to develop a euploid embryo in this particular patient. So the strategies would be, first of all, pre-treatment with androgens like DHEA, testosterone gel, and coenzyme Q. And then we can change the stimulation protocol and we can go for a milder stimulation and resulting in embryo pooling. So these embryos can be then subjected to a PGT program, and then we can go ahead with the transfer of a single or double euploid embryos. So let's talk about the pre-treatment strategies. DHEA androgens, we already know, we have already heard about them a lot. Coenzyme Q10 is an upcoming molecule. It has been seen that the aging oocytes, they have high level of ROS, and this high level of ROS then results in the DNA damage and as well as the mitochondrial dysfunction. So we can give them coenzyme Q10, which is a super antioxidant, in the dosage of 200 milligram TDS for a minimum of 2 months, and thus we can improve the mitochondrial function as well as we can improve the oocyte quality. And also there is a systematic review which was published in 2020. According to this review, those patients with poor ovarian reserve, when they were given this adjuvant treatment with DHEA, coenzyme Q and growth hormone, they have shown better clinical outcomes in terms of achieving a healthy, successful pregnancy. The next strategy would be to go for a mild stimulation. As we all know that patients with advanced age, they have diminished ovarian reserve, and even a good looking embryo might not be euploid. Only 50% of the embryos are euploid in patients with, 66% are aneuploid as compared with 51% in patients with advanced age. And various studies have shown that with the use of minimal stimulation, the aneuploidies can be brought down. So this minimal stimulation cycle, in this we either use low dose of gonadotropins in a GnRH ANDAC co-treated cycle, or we can use oral compounds with or without gonadotropins. And the main aim is that we get less number of oocytes, which we allow only those healthier follicles to develop which have a better competent oocytes. So when this protocols was suggested, it was found that the aneuploidy was reduced as compared with 63% in conventional stimulation. Only 45% of the embryos were aneuploid when the mild stimulation protocols were used. So this mild stimulation, obviously we get less number of oocytes, but they are of better quality and they produce better euploid embryos. And finally, we can subject these embryos to PGT. Now PGT is pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploidy. Herein the next gene sequencing, this is the technique which is used, and we basically test the ploidy status of all the 24 pair of chromosomes. And it was seen that around 60 to 70% of the embryos in patients with advanced age were aneuploid, as compared with only 38 to 40% in patients who are younger, who are of younger age group. So this is a very good technique which can be used in patients with advanced age. Implantation rates of around 50% were achieved as when the embryos were subjected to PGT as compared with the unscreened embryos. Now there is an upcoming technology which is the non-invasive PGT. So basically with the discovery of the free DNA, the cell-free DNA in the blastocele fluid as well as from the spent culture media, this technique was developed, and it was found that this technique has obvious advantages of being non-invasive, plus the ploidy status of the DNA, it reflected the ploidy status of the trophectoderm and ICM. But then it had some disadvantages also, in terms that the embryo, if it's a developing embryo, it will basically shed all the aneuploid cells into the surrounding culture media. So there were chances of more chances of mosaicism, as well as there were chances of contamination from the maternal DNA because of the presence of the cumulus cells. But still, it's an upcoming thing, and it may revolutionize the future IVF cycles and the future ART programs.
Very well explained, Dr. Anjali. Certainly, one thing is for sure, this case revolves around a very poor quality of embryo, and I believe the sperm is equally responsible for it. I would like to understand from Dr. Taruna, even in our day-to-day practice when we see a normal semen parameter, what tests can be done? Further evaluation of the sperm can be done, which especially in basic sperm when the basic sperm parameters are normal in such cases. Doctor, you are on, please.
Further evaluation of sperm is very important in patients with recurrent implantation failure, as sperm contributes half of the genetic material to the embryo. So for normal embryogenesis, good DNA integrity of the sperm is very important. If the sperm with high DNA integrity is there, then this can lead to defective embryogenesis and finally development of defective embryos, which are not good for implantation. And this has also been seen that if sperm with high DNA fragmentation can lead to fertilization of egg and formation of normal embryos as well. But these normal embryos ultimately fail to implant and can result in early miscarriages also. So yes, it is very important to assess the DNA integrity in patients with high in history of this recurrent implantation failure. And this has been seen that even the semen parameters are normal, even the patient is having normal karyotype, even then the DNA fragmentation index can be high. So DNA fragmentation, assessing DNA fragmentation is important in such kind of patients. Here is the study which is showing that if the sperm is having high DNA fragmentation index, this can lead to formation of defective embryos.
Okay. Very well said. What are the possible reasons for sperm DNA damage, Dr. Taruna?
Dr. Moore, there are many causes which can lead to increased DNA damage in the patient, but most important cause is post-testicular oxidative stress. So first and foremost thing to rule out is long abstinence period. There should be optimal abstinence period of 24 to 48 hours to assess the sperm DNA integrity. Then behavioral habits like smoking and alcoholism can lead to high DNA fragmentation index. If the patient is working in an environment where the heat is high, or patient is working in pesticide factories where toxin exposure is there, or patient is having radiation exposure, all these toxins can lead to high DNA damage. Genital infections with chlamydia and mycoplasma are also responsible for generation of reactive oxygen species and oxidative stress to the sperm, which can lead to DNA damage. In patients with systemic illness like diabetes and chronic renal diseases also, there is increased incidence of increased DNA damage. Varicocele can lead to all kind of abnormality in semen parameters and increased DNA damage. Apart from these, if the patient is having medications like CCBs or antidepressants, these medications are also responsible for DNA damage in sperm.
And if suppose the sperm DFI is more than 25%, how to go about in such cases?
Yes, Dr. Amol, if the patient is having high DNA fragmentation index and the patient is having history of implantation failure also, it is very important to correct this parameter first. As I told you, behavioral habits can lead to high DNA fragmentation index. So first and foremost is lifestyle modification. And yes, we have to check on this abstinence period also. First, we have to take the sperm after 24 to 48 hours of abstinence. Then we have to advise behavioral modification to patients, like if the patient is having habit of smoking or alcoholism, he has to quit that. And then if the patient is working in an environment where the toxins are high, patient has to avoid these things. Then apart from lifestyle modification, main mode of therapy for patients with high DNA fragmentation index is antioxidants. Many studies have proven that antioxidants containing vitamin C, vitamin E, selenium, and coenzyme Q given over a period of 3 to 4 months leads to decrease in DNA fragmentation. If the patient is having varicocele, then yes, it is important that patient should get corrected these varicocele. After doing all these things, even if after doing all these things patient DFI is not corrected, then yes, it is very important to use a proper sperm selection method. over period it was thought that ICSI is better than IVF in patients with high DNA fragmentation index, but later on it was realized that IVF and ICSI gives the same result in view of implantation and early miscarriages. In many studies nowadays, it has been seen that use of IMSI is better mode of sperm selection in patients with high DFI as compared to ICSI. Use of IMSI leads to 70% decrease in this improvement in implantation rate and decrease in miscarriage rate. And this has also been proven in many studies that sperms, surgically retrieved sperms are better in patients with high DFI because, as I told you, post-testicular oxidative stress is the main culprit. So, sperms are not having that post-testicular oxidative stress. It has been seen that sperms derived after TSA have 1/3 incidence of having DNA fragmentation. So TSA and IMSI till further studies are available. TSA and IMSI are better mode of using sperm in patients with high DFI.
Yeah, very well explained, Dr. Karuna. Now, as we have realized, just having good quality gametes and forming a good blastocyst is equally important, but transferring that embryo inside the most optimum site of the uterine cavity is equally responsible for having a good success rate. I would like to understand from Dr. Urmila, how can we standardize this embryo transfer technique so as to decrease the incidences of recurrent implantation failure?
Yes, Dr. Amol, as we all know that embryo transfer is the most crucial step to the success of any IVF cycle, and especially in patients of recurrent implantation failure, we should always anticipate a difficult embryo transfer and should carefully look at the records of previous embryo transfer if available. And if no records are available, then we should do a prior mock embryo transfer so that we can avoid unexpected surprises at the time of actual embryo transfer. So we should be ready with everything. So there is no consensus on the standard embryo transfer procedure, and it is for every other embryo transfer, simple basic steps we have to follow. After confirming the patient's identity, we generally do embryo transfer under ultrasound guidance with a partially full bladder, gently clean the cervix using a cotton swab, and the embryos are replaced in the mid cavity at least 1 centimeter below the fundus. Then we check for the retained embryos. If retained embryos are there, then they should be retransferred immediately, and no bed rest should be avoided, should be advised to the patients. So in these group of patients, as the transfer process is same, but we should be ready with everything. We should be prepared with hard catheter, and use of instrumentation should be a last resort because already these patients have undergone repeated IVF failures, and we should try to avoid trauma to these patients by causing unnecessary by avoiding the unnecessary handling during the embryo transfer procedure. So we should be well prepared so that they can get a better outcome.
Yeah. Also, the practice committee of ASRM in 2017 published a guideline as to a few interventions which were not useful to improve the outcome of implantation potential. And these were the acupressure techniques, giving analgesics or massage or a general anesthesia prior to embryo transfer certainly holds no validity. Also, giving prophylactic antibiotics post embryo transfer doesn't improve the success rate. A few clinicians do practice of waiting after the expulsion of embryo for any specific period of time. Again, it has no improvement in the outcome in terms of success rate. Keeping the patient in the supine position for half an hour or so is being practiced by many other clinicians. Again, this holds doesn't hold any validity or increase the success rate of implantation of an embryo. So once we have understood the quality of the importance of the quality of the embryo as well as the transfer, I would like to understand any laboratory interventions which we can do so as to improve the potential of implantation potential of the embryo. And Dr. Sashmita, can you give us more insight into this?
Yes, you see, laboratory takes a very vital role in any ART clinic. First, I would like to stress we should realize most of the time the cause of implantation failure is because of the subculture condition. So it is very important to optimize the culture condition inside the lab. We need to make our own SOP to deal with how to maintain the temperature, pH, osmolality, carbon dioxide at every level in a very meticulous and strictly way. And this SOP need to be followed by their embryologist very strictly. Now, coming to certain laboratory intervention, first let us discuss about spermatozoa selection. So why it is needed? Why the selection of spermatozoa is needed? It is because of the heterogeneity of the spermatozoa within the same ejaculated sample. So different tools are available, even if its exact role is yet to be proven. But these are the tools we have been. It has been utilized by different ART centers very widely. So one is a PIXI, or physiological intracytoplasmic sperm injection. Here the selection of the spermatozoa is done on the basis of the hyaluronic acid binding capacity, because it is believed that the spermatozoa having a hyaluronic acid binding site is supposed to be one competent one. Next is IMSI, or intramorphologically selected sperm injection, where the sperm is examined under high power field, more than 6,000 times power. And here, by studying the different organelle, presence or absence of vacuole and other organelle, we just recognize what is the most competent sperm, and it is utilized for ICSI procedure. But till now, the only confirmed indication of IMSI is recurrent implantation failure. Then other like microfluidic sperm sorter like Qualys test, where depending upon the specific gravity of the sperms, the motile sperms are separated or segregated from the non-motile sperms. And as already discussed by Dr. Toruna, when in spite of the antioxidant therapy, when the DFI is very high, then surgically retrieved testicular sperm is more preferable, as it has been observed that testicular sperm is always better than ejaculated sperm. Then next, coming to the embryo selection process, blastocyst transfer has been proven to be better as compared to cleavage stage embryo, and it could be due to the activation of the embryonic genome after cleavage stage. When the embryo reaches the blastocyst, that means its own genome has been activated. And another, better crosstalk or better synchronization between embryo and endometrium, more mimicking the normal physiology. And it is also approved by Cochrane review. So many studies and even randomized control trials have been carried out, and they prove that it is not only the implantation rate, but also the clinical pregnancy rate, ongoing pregnancy rate, and there is reduction in the pregnancy complications after transfer of the blastocyst transfer. In Indira also we follow blastocyst transfer, and we are very happy with our result. Now, it is not only the blastocyst, but also the stage and the rate of blastulation. It also impacts the implantation process. So now recent studies have revealed that a well-expanded blastocyst gives better implantation rate as compared to early blastocyst. And research studies also reveal that also timing of blastulation. That means even morphologically similar looking blastocyst, the blastocyst who has attained blastulation on day 5, that gives a better implantation rate as compared to day 6 blastocyst. Another new fancy tool that has evolved over recent years is time-lapse monitoring system. This is the technique that gives us information regarding the rate and pattern of the development of the embryos. So let us observe this small time-lapse video. Here we can see there are 9 post-ICSI zygote and how they are developing into cleavage stage embryo. Actually, every embryo is need to follow a particular pattern and particular morphokinetic and morphodynamic parameters, that is known as time-lapse marker, to become a cleavage stage embryo. But here we can see some are, some got arrested on fertilized stage, some are having some fragmentation, and maybe the 4th and the 7th embryo, they are following a regular pattern of mitotic division to become a 2-cell, 4-cell, and 6 to 8 cell. So the basic principle is the embryo which has followed the strict, dynamic criteria to develop. Its considered to be euploid, and hence it is selected for the transfer for better implantation. Here, I would also like to mention here more and more prospective studies are needed to explore its role in implantation and pregnancy. But here also I would like to say there is definitely the role of the time-lapse monitoring system in the selection of the best embryo that need to be transferred. Next, another approach that is becoming more and more popular in all the IVF center is freeze-all technique. Many of the recent studies, they are claiming freeze-all technique is better than fresh transfer. After invention of this vitrification process, this is the cryopreservation process which causes less cryo damage to the embryo and more and more post survival rate. So it also eliminates the adverse effect of controlled ovarian stimulation during breast cycle. It decreases the uterine contractility and hence increases the endometrial receptivity and implantation rate. In our center also, we routinely follow this freeze-all technique and we are very happy with our result. Next, another evidence proven approach is assisted hatching. Hatching process, is an essential part for implantation process. Sometimes it happens when the embryo is in culture or when the female is having advanced age, there is the chance of failure of hatching, and which causes failure of implantation. So assisted hatching, that means we are making a hole or we are making a breach in the zona pellucida by some techniques like chemical, mechanical or dyad laser, and we are facilitating the hatching process, and hence we are facilitating the implantation process. And it is supported by Cochrane review in 2009. Though ASRM 2007, they told the proven role in RIF in cases of poor quality of embryo, older women, and RIF cases, though routine practice is not supported by ASRM.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sashmita, for a detailed explanation. To summarize, selection of a good quality gamete is of prime importance in forming good blastocyst embryo. Procedures like microfluidics will help us select sperms with good morphology in cases of very high sperm DFI. IMSI or intracytoplasmic morphology selected implantation or a TISA procedure can help in severe oligosteroteratosis cases. Also, changing to an ANTAC stimulation protocol with prior luteal phase estradiol therapy and avoiding combined oral contraceptive pills in pre-IVF treatment certainly goes a long way in retrieval of good quality oocytes. In poor ovarian reserve cases, milder stimulation protocol is more beneficial with better outcome. Enhancing the lab potential with use of closed working chambers, benchtop incubators with time-lapse technology as suggested by Dr. Sashmita, and assisted by blastocyst culture, laser-assisted hatching, and co-culture goes a long way in increasing the success rate. Pre-implantation genetic test for aneuploidy holds a unique and promising place in selecting an euploid embryo, which will help us do an elective single embryo transfer. It it actually reduces the time to pregnancy and also decreases the miscarriage rates. And finally, thorough and appropriate counseling. I repeat, counseling of the couple with respect to the validity, viability, or feasibility of available options, along with offering them an option of gamete or an embryo donor IVF program will surely work wonders in breaking the vicious cycle of recurrent implantation field. With this, we'll come on to a different case scenario altogether. This revolves around a 33-year-old lady married since 5 years with a menstrual cycle almost of a normal flow in normal days, with, of course, with severe dysmenorrhea. She had a previous 3 attempts of IVF, all failed. She underwent an histolab, which showed a bilateral ovarian endometrioma, severe bowel adhesions were there, and endometrioma was resected. Histoscopy was done in the same setting. It was found to be normal. However, the couple didn't go ahead for any other further investigation or treatment for the next 1 year, and after which they went ahead for a routine consultation which showed an AMH of 3.4. Ultrasound showed a normal uterus, but again there was a recurrent endometrioma in both the ovaries, approximately the size of 4 centimeters. And there was also a posterior wall adenomyosis component. The endofollicle count was 5 to 6 in each, and husband semen parameters were pretty much normal. on an ultrasound, endometrium on day 18 was somewhere around 7.9 millimeter, which seems to be pretty much okay. So they proceeded ahead for an IVF process, and in the first cycle, 3 grade 1 embryos of day 3 were transferred at an endometrium of 7.8 millimeter, but the result came out to be negative. They went ahead for a second cycle, and this time frozen embryo transfer of day 3 embryos, which were cultured till blast, and 2 blastocysts of stage of AB, 4AB were formed. Laser assisted hatching was done and transferred, but then the same result, beta-Hg came out to be negative. In the third cycle, they went ahead for a fresh and tagged protocol. Blastocysts were formed, 4A and 3AB graded, and they transferred after doing a laser assisted hatching at an endometrium of 7.8 millimeter. Again, the same result, beta-Hg came out to be negative. This seems to be very distressing for the patient as well as for the doctor, treating doctor. I would like to understand from Dr. Urmila, how can we address this case?
So in this case, let us look at all the factors one by one. So the age of the patient is 33 years. If we look at the egg reserve parameters, both AMH is normal, enteral follicle count is also 5 to 6 each OD, which is slightly borderline, but AMH is okay. Endometrium thickness and hysteroscopy shows a normal cavity, and thickness is also normal. Semen analysis is normal too. So till here, the male and female parameters, they appear to be normal. But important finding in laparoscopy was the presence of bilateral endometrioma, which were resected. And then again, when she has come now for IVF, she has recurrent endometrioma with posterior wall adenomyosis. And if we look into the IVF history, she underwent 3 cycles of IVF, 2 fresh and 1 FET. Embryos were good in all the 3 cycles. Both day 3, day 5 embryo transfer was attempted. Laser was also done, but still she failed. So what seems to be unaddressed in this case, I think the one thing that has not been taken care of is the endometrioma and posterior wall adenomyosis. And studies have well shown that these conditions, they are associated with a decrease in IVF outcome. Meta-analysis was done in 2014, which clearly indicated that in patients with adenomyosis, the clinical pregnancy rates were lower and the miscarriage rates were higher. Another study in 2016 also showed that in patients with recurrent implantation failure and recurrent pregnancy loss, the incidence of adenomyosis was found to be higher. Also, some studies have also shown that the window of implantation also gets displaced in cases of adenomyosis and endometriosis. And supporting this, another meta-analysis in 2013 on approximately 9,000 women also showed that in patients with grade 3 and grade 4 endometriosis, the implantation rates were quite low. So these studies, they point towards this thing that these adenomyosis and endometriosis conditions may affect the implantation negatively and should always be considered before planning for next IVF cycle, especially in cases with recurrent implantation failure, as in this case.
Dr. Anjali, the role of surgery in such cases of adenomyosis and endometriosis, especially dealing with recurrent implantation failure cases?
Yeah, actually, Dr. Urmila has very rightly said that adenomyosis and endometriosis, they definitely affect the IVF outcome and they should be treated. There are 2 treatment modalities, medical management and surgical management. So surgical management of adenomyosis is basically, there are controversial, it's a bit of controversial, but still people have suggested that we can do a wedge resection, or we can go for a triple flap or a H-shaped incision, and we can resect the adenomyoma. Basically, in those patients who had history of recurrent implantation failure. The only problem is that there is no proper plane, so we might sometimes either leave the tissue behind, or we might go on removing excess of tissue, which ultimately can result in the myometrial weakness, and cases of uterine rupture if such patients become pregnant have been reported. And still there are no evidence-based recommendations that what is the best treatment in these group of patients. Regarding endometriosis also, endocystectomy is generally not recommended if the patient is going for IVF, because it has been seen that endocystectomy can further reduce the ovarian reserve, as well as various studies have shown that whether endometrioma was resected or not resected, the outcome was same. But still, there is a group of patients in which we would like to go ahead with endocystectomy before IVF. That would be if there is a rapid growth of the endometrioma, there are suspicious features on ultrasound, the patient is having severe pain, there's a risk of rupture, and also if we are not able to access the follicles, we feel that during ovum pickup we have to go through the endometrioma, then obviously we have to remove it, and then we should go ahead for the ovum stimulation. So yes, they should be tackled.
Yeah, very rightly said, Dr. Anjali. As suppose a clinician opts not to go for any surgical management, then probably GnRH analogs is the next step. How can we incorporate gonadotropin releasing hormone agonist in such a treatment strategy or for recurrent implantation failure cases? Dr. Shashmita, can you give us more insight on this?
Yes, basically adenomyosis is postulated to be a hyperestrogenic phase. And here the role of GnRH agonist is to suppress the HPO axis and so to make a hypoestrogenic phase. So its action could be central action or peripheral action. The central action of GnRH, as I told, the pituitary suppression, and peripheral action, it directly, as we know, the T1, T2 receptors that are present in the hypothalamus are also present in the endometrium. And in adenomyotic, the GnRH agonist, it go and it do its action on the endometrium in the adenomyotic lesion, and it causes healing process. Even studies have revealed that 50% reduction in the uterine volume after 3 to 6 doses of the GnRH analog. So in this particular case, I would like to go for a stimulation followed by a pickup and freezing the embryo, followed by 3 to 6 doses of the GnRH agonist, depending upon the severity of the disease, followed by frozen embryo transfer. Here in India, we follow the routinely this protocol in adenomyosis, and which is also supported by different retrospective studies and review articles who tell in adenomyosis the pre-treatment with the GnRH analog, it not only increases the implantation rate, but also the clinical pregnancy rate and ongoing pregnancy rate.
Yeah, very well said, Dr. Shashmita. We have been hearing a lot about endometrial scratching. Dr. Taruna, can you give us more insight into this?
Yes, Dr. Amol. As Dr. Anjali and Dr. Urmila has already mentioned that patients with adenomyosis and endometriosis have displaced window of implantation, and these patients have reduced endometrial receptivity as well. So endometrial scratching is a simple procedure which it has been proposed that injury caused by endometrial scratching causes release of cytokines like interleukin 6 and leukemia inhibitory factors, and increase recruitment of macrophages and dendritic cells, which in turn increase implantation molecules and updates implantation genes on the endometrium, and leads to increased endometrial receptivity. And it is a very simple procedure, very cost-effective procedure. But yes, we cannot recommend endometrial scratching in all ART cycle. There is a meta-analysis and Cochrane review done in 2015, which shows that endometrial injury performed in patients with recurrent implantation failure in cycle previous to ART cycle improves the endometrial receptivity. And we can simply do endometrial scratching as an OPD procedure by help of Whipple catheter in the cycle previous to the main ART cycle. This is a meta-analysis which is showing that endometrial scratching increases the live birth rate and clinical pregnancy rate in patients with recurrent implantation failure.
So to summarize, certainly the recurrent implantation failure cases demand evidence-based treatment strategy. In cases of tubal pathology like hydrosalpinx, diagnosed on transvaginal ultrasound, salpingectomy or a proximal tubal occlusion has shown dramatic improvement in implantation potential of an endometrium. Care must be taken, though, not to compromise the ovarian vascularity. Also, pituitary downregulation by GnRH analogs in adenomyosis and endometriosis cases have been proved helpful in increasing the success rate. Corrective surgery should definitely be individualized, and recent studies have put a lot of weight on the benefits of luteal phase endometrial injury. Certainly, it should be considered. Now, coming on to a final case scenario, which revolves around a 34-year-old lady who is married since 6 years. Previous 4 IUI cycles were done and all failed, with an hysterosalpingography was perfectly normal. Investigations were done, AMH was found to be 4, ultrasound showed a normal uterus and normal bilateral ovaries with an antral follicle count of 7 to 8 in each. Endometrium on day 18 was somewhere around 8.5 millimeters. So all the parameters okay. Semen analysis was normal with a DFI of 18%. They went ahead for an IVF cycle. In the first cycle, 3 grade 1, day 3 embryos were transferred. Result was negative. Proceeded ahead for a diagnostic histolaparoscopy. Again, all the parameters were normal. So they went ahead for a second cycle. In this, 3 grade 1 embryos, day 3, which are frozen, were transferred, and then at an endometrium of 8.4 millimeter, but the same result, beta estrogen negative. Went ahead for a second frozen embryo transfer cycle. This time they proceeded for a blastocyst culture, and 2 grade 1 blastocysts were transferred, but the same result came, beta estrogen negative. A couple went ahead for a fourth IVF or XC cycle, wherein they went ahead for a fresh and tag protocol. 4 blastocysts were formed. They opted for a pre-implantation genetic screening for an euploidy test, and after an euploid embryos were found, they cryopreserved them. Now the couple has come to us for a second opinion before proceeding for any further process. I would like to put in here in this way. Let us first understand the intricacies in this case which are involved. This case revolves around a 34-year-old with good ovarian reserve parameters as listed by the values, and the sperm DNA integrity is also adequate since the DFI is 18%. The very fact that good quality day 5 blastocysts have formed and adequately proven by a pre-implantation genetic screening for aneuploidy, and they are found to be euploid, I believe that in this case, the gametes or the embryo probably are not at fault. Also, the endometrial thickness is adequate with no detectable pathology in the histolaparoscopy which was performed. Assuming the endocrinal hormonal parameters are well taken care of and a standardized embryo transfer technique was followed, we can take help of endometrial receptive array test to understand any displacement of the window of implantation of endometrium. However, after all these investigations, still the immunological factor seems to be left off and needs to be definitely ruled out. As we all know, this factor is responsible for almost 8 to 10% of cases of recurrent implantation failure, and it should be definitely and adequately dealt with. So, I would like to ask Dr. Taruna, how can we actually check for this alloimmune, especially in cases of recurrent implantation failure?
Yes, Dr. Amol. Checking for this alloimmunity is very simple. We have to do blood test of both the partners, husband as well as wife. We have to do lymphocyte cross match. We have to do natural killer cells parameters. We have to check for serum and TNF alpha and uterine CD56 cells. If lymphocyte cross match is negative, NK cells are high, serum TNF alpha is high, and uterine CD56 expression is high, then yes, patient is having alloimmunity and patient needs immunomodulation.
Okay. So, if suppose the alloimmunity is present, how can we manage it?
Yes, Dr. Amol, if the patient, by these tests we can see that patient needs immunomodulation. Now this immunomodulation is of two types, active immunomodulation and passive immunomodulation. Even if we are doing active immunomodulation, we have to give passive immunomodulation as well to the patient after embryo transfer with the help of low molecular weight heparin, IVIG, intralipids and corticosteroids and HCQ as well. For active immunomodulation, the mode of active immunomodulation is lymphocyte immune therapy. Here is the study which is showing that this is a recent tool, and this study is showing that lymphocyte immune therapy helps increasing clinical pregnancy and viable birth rate in patients with implantation failure. Lymphocyte immune therapy is a very simple and OPD based procedure. In this, we take the blood of husband and extract lymphocyte from blood of the husband and inject these lymphocytes on the subcutaneous or intradermal route to the female partner. This is, as I told you, is the OPD based procedure. After taking the alloimmune causes, if this is planned, this can be done in a single day. And there are no much complication apart from injection site allergic reactions. This procedure is very much safe. In our own experience, we have done lymphocyte immune therapy for more than 100 patients with recurrent implantation failure, and we are seeing very good results. Around 78% ongoing clinical pregnancy rate we are seeing with this lymphocyte immune therapy.
Exactly. In our routine practice, we do take help from low molecular weight heparin, and it's been rampantly used. I would like to understand from Dr. Urmila, does it have any role in increasing the implantation potential?
Yes, Dr. Amol, all of us are using low molecular weight heparin in patients of previous IVF failure. So all of us are aware of its anticoagulation effect, but along with the anticoagulation effect, it has certain favorable effects on the endometrium, and thus it increases the chances of conception and implantation. It upregulates various growth factors in the endometrium, increases angiogenesis, and increases the expression of various cytokines, promotes the early embryo development, and thus it increases the chances of implantation. So recent analysis, meta-analysis was done in 2013, including 2 RCTs and 1 quasi-RCTs. They continued low molecular weight heparin from day of embryo transfer till 12 weeks, and in one study they continued it till delivery, in which there was one coagulation defect, and they found that the groups in which there were 2 or 3 IVF failures, the live birth rates were significantly higher as compared to the control group. So yes, definitely heparin plays a role in this group of patients. But then again, a recent review article which was published in 2018, it shows that there is still lack of strong evidence in favor of low molecular weight heparin, and still further RCTs and large trials are required to establish its role and to identify the group of the patients which might be benefited the most by using this drug. But definitely there is a group of patients in which we can use this drug and increase the chances of conception, especially in patients with recurrent implantation failure.
Yes. As we all have read, recent papers have highlighted a lot about peripheral blood mononuclear cells. I would like to understand from Dr. Shashmita, is there any role, and probably can you give us more information about peripheral blood mononuclear cell therapy?
Yes, Dr. Romo. Well, Dr. Taruna has narrated very nicely regarding the role of immunology in implantation process. So, dear friends, by this time we learned that an initial inflammatory reaction is needed to initiate the implantation process, which is provided by the maternal immunocyte. And studies have revealed that sometimes it happens that the maternal immunocyte that is recruited to the uterine endometrium is inadequate to produce that response. So it causes implantation failure. So in this scenario, peripheral blood mononuclear cells therapy is applicable. Here, the autologous female blood is withdrawn, and it is processed by density gradient method, and the peripheral blood mononuclear cells are isolated. Then different protocols are followed. In one protocol, the freshly prepared mononuclear cells are transfused inside the uterine cavity at a quantity of 10 to 20 million per 200 microliter of PBS 1 to 3 days prior to the embryo transfer. In second protocol, the prepared peripheral blood mononuclear cell sample is further cultured for 24 to 48 hours in the presence of some activator like HCG or human serum albumin or HLG. Then the cultured one is transferred. In third protocol, they combine both freshly prepared and cultured peripheral blood mononuclear cell therapy 1 to 3 days prior to the embryo transfer. So now it is gaining more and more attention, and if you see most of the studies from 2018 to 20, they are telling promising result in this therapy. Recently, one study is there in April 2020 in the Journal of Reproductive Immunology, where they told it is not only the implantation rate, but also the clinical pregnancy rate, ongoing pregnancy rate, and live birth rate is higher in case of treated group as compared to non-treated group. Here, I would like to share with you a systemic meta-analysis which was carried by Kehan et al. In the year 2019, taking 1173 cases of recurrent implantation failure where they considered 3 coherent and 2 randomized controlled trials. And in their study, again, they showed that it is not only the implantation rate, but also this new therapy, it increases the clinical pregnancy rate and also live birth rate. So in my personal practice also, now I'm just going to start this therapy. So I also can suggest you, if you rule out other causes like endometrial and embryonal, and really you feel like it is an immunological cause, then you also can start this therapy and see the result.
Yeah. Considering the fact that we have taken care of immunology, I suppose post-embryo transfer management holds also equally important place. Dr. Anjali, can you give us more insight into this?
Yeah. So basically, my co-panelists, they have very beautifully told about the immunological factors, and they do play a major role in patients of RIF. So luteal phase support do play a major role in the success of these patients, and we have to take care of these probable causes of RIF. So apart from the luteal phase support, the patient should remain free from any stress, and she should remain physically active. That is most important. So let's talk about the luteal phase support. Progesterone, as we all know, we all are giving. We can give either Defeston 10 mg TDS, or we can give natural micronized progesterone 400 mg BD per vaginally. LMWH has already been told 40 mg subcutaneous is the prophylactic dosages that can be given till beta HCG, and if it is positive, then it should be continued for minimum of 12 weeks. Steroids also, they take care of our immunological factors. Visalon can be given 5 mg BD to TDS. Now intralipids. So intralipids are the fat emulsions, and they basically they act as an immunomodulator, and they basically suppresses the NK cell activity. So intralipids, 20% of 250 ml is given in the form of a drip. 3 days before embryo transfer, and then 1 week post ET, and then every 15 days till 20 to 24 weeks. Immunoglobulins are again, these are immunomodulators. They act in a similar way. They suppress NK cell activity as well as upregulates the function of Th1 cells, downregulates the function of Th2 cells. Immunoglobulins, there are 2 types, intravenous and intramuscular. Intravenous we are not using because of the cost factor. Intramuscular 16.5% injection is given every 21 days starting from the day of embryo transfer, and also it should be continued till 20-24 weeks. So yes, we have in our own personal experience, we have seen good results when we have given these agents to these group of patients where we are suspecting immunological factors leading to recurrent implantation failure.
Yeah. Very well explained, Dr. Anjali. I suppose we have tapped onto almost every aspect of this topic, recurrent implantation failure. Now I would like to conclude here with this simple flowchart which I have displayed. I suppose it explains all. The cornerstone of recurrent implantation failure case management lies in thorough counseling of the couple involved in terms of the viable options left for them to take, and a multidisciplinary approach will help the distressed couple to choose a more practical and a more feasible suggested option as by the doctor. As discussed, an array of investigation in our armamentarium is there, along with thorough understanding of previous treatment strategies should be definitely taken care, and a probable cause to be detected has to be detected to act upon. Finally, I would suggest a more individualized treatment protocol to be adopted for recurrent implantation failure cases based on the most recent available evidences. I thank you all for a very patient hearing.